Welcome to the Chaos and Light podcast. Welcome to the Chaos and Light podcast. I am your host, Angela Levesque. Well, it's been a while, hasn't it? Yes, I have been taking care of some other things in my life that required my focus. So I took a little break from this, but I'm excited to be back today talking to Iva Kenaz, and we have a fantastic conversation about sacred geometry. We go into some of the basic symbols, their meaning, how we work with them, and then we talk about how sacred geometry speaks to deeper parts of ourselves. If you haven't checked out my YouTube channel lately, I've been making and playing with sacred geometry, creating these meditative, I call them moving meditations, and working with, Metatron's cube, the Merkaba, different number, the power in 5, for example. So go ahead and check that out. These are something that I'm quite excited about. And if you haven't been to the Chaos and Light website, some big things are coming. I'm going to be adding a couple new offerings soon, so stay tuned for that. Please go to chaosandlight.com if you haven't been there in a while. Well, we will be right back after this ridiculously short break with Iva Kenaz. Are you enjoying this podcast and want to help this lady out? Well, share it with friends, or even better, leave a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear from you. Now back to the show. I'm here today with Iva Kenaz. She's an award-winning author, publisher, and speaker from Prague, Bohemia, whose books are significantly influenced by metaphysics and nature magic. She studied screenwriting at the Prague Film Academy and holds an MA in creative writing. She's also an avid researcher of ancient wisdom teachings, especially those of the magic symbols, sacred geometry, runes, and the world tree of life. So with that, I am very honored to welcome Iva Kenaz to the program. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm very excited to have you here. So many of my listeners know that I've been on this journey with sacred geometry. I bought this software back in July, and it has been, I would say, nothing short of transformational, being able to work with these symbols. I've had some degree of understanding about them for some time, but I really decided to go deeper. So I bought your book called Sacred Geometry and Magical Symbols. And I thought, wow, I'm going to reach out and see if I can interview on the Chaos and Light podcast. So I'm very excited to have you here. So tell us a little bit about we went through a quick bio there, but a little bit about your journey and how you got interested in working with sacred geometry.
Yes. First of all, thank you for getting the book. I hope you can find a lot of inspiration in it. And my journey to sacred geometry has been quite long. I started around when I was around 18, 19, because that's when I started to study astrology. And through astrology, I came to study symbolism and ancient symbols. And through that, I somehow got to sacred geometry. But I really, when I started to really research it, I started to see these connections between the magic symbols and the geometric patterns. And I realized that it's all one and the same, and that why these symbols are so powerful and have been used for thousands of years is because they derive from these basic primordial patterns that nature uses to create life. And that's what fascinated me since then, and to see these connections, how these natural patterns repeat in nature over and over, in the microcosm, macrocosm. It's all around us and within us. And that's just to sum up my journey to that. But I still keep finding new correlations and still new mysteries, new magic in this topic. So I believe it's still going to go on this journey, and I'm still in a learning process as I write the books about my research and findings so far.
What I think is really neat is, like you mentioned, in nature, being able to see these patterns, whether you're cutting an apple and you can see the star, the five pointed star there, or the spiral in a snail shell. And I also think it's really interesting. I've been watching, I don't know if you've seen this program, it's on the History Channel here. It's called The Ancient Aliens. And they go to a lot of, it's kind of a little bit silly, but they go to a lot of these ancient sites. And when you look at these beautiful, like, sacred temples and these sites that were constructed, thousands of years ago, you see those same shapes depicted on many of their creations. And I just find that so beautiful.
Yes. And also what this program shows is how all these symbols and sightings connect, even though they are in different parts of the world. And that's what I find fascinating with many of the symbols also, that like some symbols, you see them in Iceland and then in ancient India, and you're wondering like how did this happen? That these like different distant cultures created the same symbols and the same kind of veneration of these symbols.
Yeah. It's very fascinating to me. And it seems to me then that it goes so much deeper than they're just beautiful shapes. And I want to talk a little bit about how, when we can look at something like a symbol and it speaks to something that isn't just our conscious mind. Like we can talk, and we're going to talk about some of the basic symbols and what they mean, but there's a way that we receive it that's much deeper and speaks to us in a place that's like beyond just our conscious mind. And we don't need to necessarily understand that, oh, this symbol means that, and that symbol means that. It speaks to a part of us that I think on some level we know, even if we can't pull up consciously, oh yeah, that square speaks to this. Do you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. And that's what I love about that each person can view the symbol a bit differently. And that's why also with my book, The Sacred Geometry and Magical Symbols, I wanted to be quite, I didn't want to go into too much detail because I wanted to leave the imagination to the reader, because symbols really are fluid. And even though like some basic archetypes apply in our minds, each person can view each symbol a bit differently. And I think that's so important, to use the intuition and imagination and to really co-create the meanings of the symbols as you go along. If you work with them, or if you choose to I don't know, meditate with them, they might always bring like different symbolism or different messages. So I think that's so important to just keep your mind open and your heart open to the messages that they receive.
Yeah,
that they give out.
Yeah. In my little sacred geometry animations, I always start it with, breathe in, breathe out, and then receive, because it's really about having those images move and leave sort of their imprint or their, I don't know, their code, or I don't know exactly the language I want to use, because just being able to watch them unfold interacts with your energy body. It interacts with your unconscious and subconscious mind. And you don't need to be like walked through okay, so now you're looking at Metatron's cube. This is what Metatron's cube means, and this is how you receive it. Just by the very nature of, the construction of them, it has so much available to you.
Yes. That's why it's sometimes hard to write about certain things, because this is like beyond the verbal world. It's like a different dimension. So when you try to verbalize it, it gets very tricky, because some things are really like up to people to experience. And but I still try to write about it, but sometimes it's tricky.
You do a fantastic job.
Oh, thank you.
And maybe this is getting really weird here, but I was in meditation once, and I was taken back into the void space, and I was shown that the next kind of layer outside of the void is geometry. Like it's, as we move from the formless into the form, right after that void space is the geometry of all things, and the way that geometry comes together, and that the way that they begin to create the basic forms of life. That was kind of the next layer of reality. What do you think about that?
I love that. I mean, that's how I view it. I view it as these like tools that nature or God create with. So it makes total sense that it would be like from the void come these shapes, and they form realities and everything. So that makes total sense. And then it leaves these little like mysterious codes in the creation, so the creation can look back at maybe where it came from originally. And maybe through these shapes, even we can get closer to the divine mind, to the creator, or, whatever you believe in. So, yeah, I love it.
Good. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about some of the basic shapes. In your book, you start with circle. And first, I want to ask, do shapes take on primarily like a masculine or feminine? Like when you think circle, I think of the divine feminine. Is that necessarily how it goes, or does the circle represent both?
Yes, it can be. I mean, that's again up to us to decide. But traditionally in geometry or sacred geometry, they say that the rounded shapes are feminine and the lines are masculine. So, but we could also translate it as the conscious and subconscious mind, the conscious being the masculine principle and the subconscious being the feminine. So I don't know, but of course the circle represents wholeness and unity of both. And I think that's what yin and yang has so beautifully incorporated, that it's the yin and yang within the circle. So it's the unity of both. But like if we started from the very beginning of creation of geometry, we would go to the first point, right? Which could be the void. And then we draw a line before we make a circle symbolically. So there's like, it could be even like the miniature feminine and then the masculine, and then we have the wholeness, but again, the feminine. It always repeats in itself, which I find very interesting. But I think you could go for both.
And so let's talk a little bit more about the circle and maybe some of the other shapes that are derived from the circle. So if you could just give us a little bit more about the meaning and maybe some of the more significant shapes that are also derived from it.
Yes. So, well, if we go from the wholeness of the circle, and then if we draw two circles that are merged, two circles of the same ratio, if they are like merged in their central points, we get the Vesica Pisces shape, sometimes called mandorla, depending on how it's positioned, because the mandorla shape is vertical Vesica Pisces, because it looks like almond when you look at it. Mandorla translates as almond in Italian and Latin. So that's like the almond shape, and that's been in symbolic language. The almond has been associated with new beginnings, and something new is being born, because almond is the first tree that blooms in spring in the Mediterranean. So it was always connected to new beginnings and like this new cycle of life and all these things like flowering. And so that's why it has been symbolic for new beginnings. But at the same time, also it looks, or it resembles a kind of a gate. So it's like, you could say, from the void, you come from the void of the circle, you come to the gate through which all the other shapes are born, because from this shape, the mandorla or Vesica Pisces, you can create all the other shapes. And you start to notice if you draw it, if you just take a compass and you start drawing the circles, you realize that if you want to construct more complicated geometries, you always use the Vesica Pisces to construct them. So all the geometries are born symbolically from this shape. And also they have compared it to the vulva, like, the shape from which we are born into this world. So it's all connected. And then if you twist it, not horizontally, but horizontally from the vertical mandorla, you get the Vesica Pisces, because it starts to resemble a fish. Vesica Pisces means fish bladder, so it's symbolic fish, but also eye. So it's you have the eye symbolism and the fish symbolism coming there, which is kind of similar if you think about it to the new beginnings and gates also, because fish has always been a symbol of the ocean, and ocean not only in a physical sense, but also in the metaphysical, so the streams of consciousness or subconscious. And the universe has also been called like the space ocean. That's why we have the spaceship words and spacecraft and so forth. So you have the symbolism of this vastness there as well, and the fish being like this one thing that is like pulled from that subconscious or from that stream of subconscious mind. And then another symbolism is the eye. So it has often been compared to the third eye, which is again, like if we take that the third eye is our pineal gland, you again have the water there because the pineal gland is full of water. So it's like kind of, the symbolism is all connected. And the third eye being our ability to see beyond this physical realm into the metaphysical worlds or our inner worlds. So this shape has so much symbolism, and it applies to different symbols throughout history, throughout ancient history. For this, it would be better to show you pictures, because it's, it gets a bit complicated to talk about it. What is vertical, horizontal, and then the shapes. But yeah, it's a very fascinating shape of its own, this Vesica Pisces or mandorla.
So let's talk for a moment about the triangle. And funny, speaking of ancient aliens, I was just making a geometry animation on the triangle, and then I watched a video about the triangle, and it's amazing how much like the triad shows up throughout ancient history, just whether it's mind, body, spirit, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, there's lots of ways where that triad comes into our collective consciousness. And so tell me a little bit about the symbolic meaning of the triangle, and maybe some of the ways that it is also other derivatives of it.
Yeah, so we have the upward triangle and the downward triangle. So if we start with the upward, the one pointing up, it has been like the most common symbolism of that triangle is, again, the conscious mind, the masculine principle that is within us all. We all have the yin and yang, right? Masculine, feminine. So it's the conscious mind, and also the symbolic fire. So light of spirit, light of inspiration. It's in magic. It's been used to ignite maybe inspiration or ideas, but also to stimulate the conscious mind to greater intelligence or greater perception of certain things. So it has also symbolized the rational mind. And the down pointing triangle has been connected to the opposite. So the feminine, the subconscious mind, the yin principle that is within us all, and also to the water element. So you have the fire and the water elements coming together, which is also the basic elements of Norse mythology is water and fire, or ice and fire. And they are really the basic elements. So I think that these two triangles kind of complement each other. And it's good to maybe harmonize them if you work with magic symbols. And the best way to find their harmony is to merge them, and then you get the six-pointed star or the Star of David or Shaktuna in India. So it has, again, the symbolism of merging of the dualities, the yin and yang, the masculine, feminine, conscious, subconscious. And then you have the perfect unity of these two. I love it how in geometry you always have these like, it's kind of like dualities coming together over and over again. You have the triangles and then, the hexagons and the pentagons, and it all like starts to create other shapes. Yeah.
Well, we're going to do one more basic one, and then I want to go into some of the, I think when we think about sacred geometry, like Metatron's cube and the flower of life and the Merkaba and those sorts of things. So let's talk about the square.
Yeah, well, the square is the square and cross come hand in hand. They have similar symbolism, and square has always represented materia. So like this material world, the physical world. That's why it's been often used to manifest something in the physical world, but also to protect it. So it has this manifesting and shielding quality to it. And both the cross and the square, they can, mean the same things. Also, if you double them into the 8-pointed stars, you have the double cross or double square, then you just double the meaning of the cross or the square. And they are really powerful for protection and shielding, as well as manifesting. And again, like it's quite interesting how it's similar to the circle, that you cannot really say if it has the masculine or feminine principle, because the square and the material world has often been symbolic for the feminine, but then like the straight lines in sacred geometry mean the masculine. So it could again represent both, which is quite interesting. Like maybe it's meant to merge these two dualities in our world or our matrix. But I have personally good experience with squares and crosses when it comes to shielding and protecting myself or my home, my dear ones. I often like draw the 8-pointed star or just the simple cross, even over my home before I leave and such. So yeah, I would recommend working with it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about working with some of these basic shapes, the circle, the triangle, the square, or the cross. You had mentioned, drawing it over your house before you leave. What are some other ways that we can work with some of these shapes? Do we draw them? Are there different mudras we can use? What are some examples of how we work with them?
Yes. Well, some of them, and I think you saw it in my book, that some of them can even be exercised as body postures. Like you can literally stand in the shape, such as the cross or the pentagram, the 5-pointed star, or you can create the triangles with your hands to bring in the power of the shape or the geometry or the symbol or whatever you like to call it. But there are also ways, of course, to draw it. You can draw it and hang it up at home or your workplace or in your car for protection, or you can draw it with affirmations, like to enhance your manifestation. That's actually a great way, like if you are familiar with the shapes and what they can support, you can then draw it on a piece of paper and then put the message, either like inscribe it into it, or you can write it on a piece of paper and kind of roll it and put it in the center of that shape. You can also use it, to recharge your food or water. You can have the symbols on a piece of paper or have it printed on something and then put it under your water or under your food overnight. You can also put it under your pillow if you want to maybe protect or receive some guidance in your dreams, or just have a reviving sleep. There are so many ways. You can also just meditate on them. And then, of course, if you draw them or paint them, you can then combine them with color symbolism. So, each color then can support the magic or the healing that you wish to achieve with that symbol. So there are so many ways.
Yes, I find that using them as the focus of my meditation is really powerful for me. So when I started creating these sacred geometry animations, I noticed some really interesting things happen. One, I started to feel a deeper connection to nature as I would walk around, and not even if I was like witnessing a specific shape, like the spiral or something, but there was something about connecting to the shapes of everything. Like, at some point, as I talked about, I had that meditation where the geometry was kind of the next layer on our movement from the formless into form. And I found that I had just this deep connection with all of the natural world, that there was something activated inside me that just made me feel closer and I think less separate than everything else around me. And I thought that was really beautiful. So I'll let you speak to that for a second if you've got some thoughts.
And by the way, your videos are amazing. I love
thank
them.
you.
These connections it's so fascinating, like when you start to notice it. And for me, it works as a sort of divination as well, because when I keep seeing certain shapes on my walks, I walk a lot and I hike in nature and in the forest. So I often notice shapes and symbols on my path or in the trees. And especially when it becomes a synchronicity of symbols or shapes, I realize that it's a kind of a guidance. So it really can be a kind of a divination that nature brings forth, because these shapes are part of us. So they speak to us and our intuition. And I think this interconnectedness is really beautiful, like you describe. I often feel this too when I go for walks and everything just starts to click and connect, and how the world is created in such a beautiful way.
It is very beautiful. The other thing I've noticed when I work with them, especially Metatron's cube, which we'll talk about next, is time seems to be more malleable. And it seems like it's a little bit more, fluid than I think about. So as I watch these shapes, and it could be the nature of the animation of it moving around, but there's something about the ability to not manipulate, but to stretch or to stretch time. Does that seem very strange?
No, that's very interesting. I mean, it is probably connected to that. I believe, and that's going really metaphysical, but I believe that some of the shapes can become gateways into other dimensions or other time space, other times. And they can really, I have this a lot in my novels, that the heroes like walk through these gates into other dimensions, or they time travel through these shapes. So it makes sense like that you reach beyond that, because I like that.
Let's talk about Metatron's cube, which through reading your book, I realized that Metatron's cube contains all of the Platonic solids. So if you could speak for a moment and explain what the Platonic solids are, and then talk about the significance of Metatron's cube.
Yes. Well, for me, I always go back to Plato, because he's the first teacher that we know of sacred geometry, and he had his academy that actually had this inscription, like, "Those ignorant of geometry shall not enter," or something like that. So he taught sacred geometry at his academy, and that's why we have the Platonic solids, because he came up with the idea that each of the Platonic solids symbolizes different element. So you have these 5 Platonic solids and 5 different basic elements. The fifth being the ether, which is often forgotten or often, is not included in the basic elements, which actually interestingly, it's the dodecahedron, and dodecahedron is made of pentagons. And the pentagon and pentagram and dodecahedron were so sacred to Plato that he punished those who spoke about the mystery of these shapes by death. It was punishable by death to speak about it beyond the mystery school, which is quite extreme. It must have been something really important there. And it's the fifth element, which is supposed to be the ether, the akasha. So it's something really mysterious there. But these 5 Platonic solids, if you put them together, you get the Metatron's cube, kind of. But the Metatron's cube really derives from the flower of life. If you leave out some of the outside circles, again, it would be better to show it on a picture, but if you leave out, some of the circles and you connect all the central points with straight lines, you get the Metatron cube from the flower of life. And and then you have all these Platonic solids. So it's basically the cube of creation and of these Platonic solids or elements that create this world. So it's a really, I find it a strong meditation shape. Mm-hmm. I haven't been experiencing anything like working with it magic wise or manifesting wise or shielding wise, but really for meditation and for realizing the connections in the world and between the elements and the elements within our being, because we are elemental beings. So it's a really, I would say it's a shape for the masters and for people that like to meditate, that can really master their mind and consciousness. And for them, this shape is brilliant. You start to notice many I don't know if master is the right word. How would you put it? Mystic, maybe rather a mystic, not a master. Someone who is, a lot into meditation and these metaphysical practices. And then these things start to click when you meditate with it.
I have a funny story. So my husband, he has a lot of tattoos. He put the flower of life, which we'll talk about next, on his arm. And then at the top, he put the Metatron's cube on his shoulder.
Wow.
And he comes home and I said, do you understand what you just put on your body? He's like, I just found these shapes and I was really drawn to them and I love them. And I'm like, well, that's the flower of life. And this is Metatron's cube on your shoulder. And it was so funny because he didn't know at the time. And now after the fact, he's done a lot more research and learned a lot more about it. But I just thought it was so funny that I was like, you put some pretty sacred stuff on your body. And it was kind of out of the blue, which was pretty interesting.
Drawn to it.
Yes.
That's very interesting. Well, maybe he knows them from his past lives and it just came back to him.
I would assume something like that. Yeah. And we also, actually above our bed, we had somebody make a giant flower of life. It's out of metal, actually, and it hangs over our bed. And it's just beautiful because both of us are very drawn to it. So talk a little bit about the significance of the flower of life.
We have the same, above our bed, a giant silver flower of life.
Exactly.
And I believe it's like a giant dream catcher, I believe it helps. But the flower of life is a coalescence of circles of the same perimeter, and they coalesce in the central point. So they create this kind of a flower. And we first have 6 around the central one, so 7. And then we have 12 around the 6, and then 24 around those 12. So it becomes wider and wider if you draw more and more circles. And this shape, for me, it's really like a shape of that. It literally gives birth to the other shapes. So if you connect the dots, which is also symbolic, you connect the dots, you get all kinds of shapes. You get like we said, the Metatron cube, the Platonic solids. You get all the shapes like hexagon, hexagram, squares, triangles, of course, the Vesica Pisces, the mandorlas, and also you get all the runes, the Norse runes or the Viking runes or whatever they're called, so many different names. So you can actually observe all these shapes in the flower of life, and it, for me, it's like some kind of a net or a well. I like to compare it to a well of the universal mind, because when you meditate with it, it really brings you, like, it just starts to, like, all the inspiration and all the things that maybe didn't make sense before start to suddenly like make sense and start to become clearer. And I even like to compare it to this ancient well of wisdom that is in, again, Norse mythology, because that's my passion, so I always go to that. When Odin symbolically threw his eye into the well of ancestral wisdom and he perceived all the runes, for me, that well of ancestral wisdom could very well be the flower of life. And even the eye symbolism, like the third eye that he maybe threw in, like that he looked at with his third eye, I find that very beautiful, like this this comparison. Yeah, so for me personally, it's like a great shape to meditate with, and especially before you go to sleep, it can bring about so much guidance in sleep and in dreams. So yeah, but it's overall like, the basic shape that has all the other shapes in it.
So if there is something that you want to bring from the formless into form, so there's something that you'd like to manifest in your life, is there a certain shape that you use to facilitate that?
The square and the cross would be a good way to start, or then the double, so the 8-pointed star or double square star. Also, like, I think that because the hexagon and hexagram symbolize matter and this matrix, then I would say that hexagonal patterns as well, they help bring things into life, so they help us manifest. But it's also interesting in geometry that the shapes that are connected to the odd numbers represent the movement, while the even numbered shapes, or how could I put it? Shapes that are made of even numbers represent more like the stillness and the manifesting or the solidifying energy. So when we manifest, we want to bring both into the game. So it really depends on what you wish to manifest or what you wish to heal or shield. And then you make your own specific combinations because you can decide where you wish to bring more movement and progress and where you want to like rather bring more stability and grounding. So I would say they all like work together.
And you mentioned as well for shielding and protection. And I think that you were talking about the square. What could somebody do, utilizing the square in order to create a shield? Is this something that you would meditate on? Is this something that you might put on your altar? What are some of the ways that you could use these shapes for shielding or protection?
Yes, it can be imagination, meditation, or drawing it. It's what is also very powerful is if you draw it with your inner sight over the place or the person that you wish to protect. So, or with your hand, you can draw a square or a cross or an 8-pointed star over, in the air, over some place or person. It's really very much like when you work with the Reiki symbols, that, you can draw them in the air, or you can have them literally like drawn and printed, or just imagine them. And the intention is enough. If the clear intention, there's so much power in that I think, that on its own is already like this potent magic. But then like the more attention you bring to that intention, the better, of course. But yeah, the intention is the key. So it's very fluid.
We have a few minutes left. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on?
Well, I maybe a little bit about that. I know that some symbols and some geometries are being misunderstood terribly because they've been misused by many agendas and many people throughout the history. So I would just like to touch a bit on that, because I always feel so sorry when people connect these symbols and these shapes only to the negative that it's been connected to, because it's not. It's like you would say, like many people like consider the hexagon, for example, or hexagram evil because some evil agendas misused it. But if you think about it, the hexagons are in our DNA. It's in the core of this world. It's in the atomic structure. It's in how the molecules form. It's pentagonal and hexagonal. So they cannot be inherently bad. There is like this goodness, and I suppose it's like a tool, that some hands decide to use it for something good, and some hands decide to use it for something bad. So I think that's important to say, to protect these symbols and the shapes, because they're not evil. Yeah.
When I lived in Japan, I moved back just a few months ago. On the map, you would look and you would see the swastika symbol, but it actually was the reverse, the mirror image of it. And at first I was like, what? That is really weird, right? Yeah. And then it actually shows on where the temples are, the Buddhist temples are on the map.
Yeah. Yeah.
So as you're saying that, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'm sure at some point that symbol was co-opted by Germany and in the
well, Hitler was very much into magic, and so he like used symbols in his agendas, also runes, but he like had a way of twisting it. Like if you look at it, it's either reversed or it's somehow like distorted. It's not really the original shape. But yeah, it was in the wrong hands. They are powerful symbols and powerful shapes. And when they are in the wrong hands, it's just,
Well, and I know for myself, I grew up in a very strong Baptist background, and like the pentagram was the sign of the devil. And so, to see the pentagram with a circle around it, and that was always a shape that
pagan. But it's interesting that here in Czech Republic, where I live, like we often have pentagrams in the medieval churches. They're actually like in the windows, and it's interesting that like really like early medieval churches. So it must have been like somehow venerated by Christianity as well. It's interesting how these things get twisted around.
But I guess on some level, whoever was using them for their own means knew how powerful they were. Yeah. And yes, as you said, it's too bad that some of them have been given a kind of a bad name because of the way that they had been used.
Yeah. Yeah. I always feel sorry when I see this because it's so far from the truth. Yeah.
Yes. Well, this has been wonderful. I want to give you the opportunity to share with my listeners where they can find your books, leave them with, I'll make sure I have your website, and I might even include some little diagrams of the shapes we talked about today, so they have a good idea in case they can't picture it. But share with my listeners how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, so my website, ivakenaz.com, Kenaz.com, and I have my books available online on most places. Some of the books went into distribution in the States and Canada, so they should be in bookstores, but otherwise you can find them online on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all these main channels.
Well, wonderful. I want to thank you so much for coming on the Chaos and Light podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun.
Are you enjoying this podcast and want to help this lady out? Well, share it with friends, or even better, leave a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear from you. Now back to the show. Well, that is it for today's episode of the Chaos and Light podcast. I have included many of the shapes that we talked about within the show notes on chaosandlight.com, and you'll be able to find this on the homepage or under the Chaos and Light recent episodes page as well. Well, that's it. Take care and seek the mystery.